1977, and long before that, when he lived here, was a Michigan atheist and still is in heart. He's been on the board of directors for American Atheists since 1984 and has also been a past president. He is the editor of the American Atheist Press, author of many books, many of which are also available at our tables over there. And I hope you all have the handout he has with you about in his speech, about the existence of Nazareth at the supposed time of Jesus. And not only has Frank been a friend for a long time, I know that anytime I need the translation of Sanskrit, I have a friend that I can turn to. So it's always comforting to know.
Sanskrit reference to the request, and so the best Sanskrit motto I can think of off the top of my head is Ratam Ratnena Samachati, which means birds of a feather flock together, basically. It's jewels come together with jewels, and here we are jewels. So I really appreciate the invitation to come back to my home state. I don't often get a chance to come back to Michigan. But I really want to thank Marty and Michigan Atheists for inviting a native son back home. As Marty indicated, I'm the editor of American Atheist Press, and I bought a whole bunch of brand new American Atheist Press titles that are on sale over here at steeply discounted prices. Most of them are $5 a piece, a couple of them are $10, and there's one title for $2. But I hope you'll be able to, everyone will be able to afford some of them and see what American Atheist Press has been publishing over the years. Well, my title is, as you just heard, Bart Ehrman. Whoops. Bart Ehrman, Jesus of Nazareth, and me. Just curious, how many of you know who Bart Ehrman is? Okay, well, that's not quite as many as I expected, so let me just say a second. Bart Ehrman is arguably the most famous, or best known, of New Testament scholars in America. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He has written many books on Jesus and the New Testament. I watched his career for 30 years. And predicted many years ago that he would become an atheist. He did. I also predicted that he would become a mythicist, that is, someone who denies the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, I was wrong. He didn't. And as a matter of fact, in 2012, Bart published a book called Did Jesus Exist? And in it, he took me to task for some of the articles that were in volume 1 of my collected short works called Through Atheist Eyes. So we were 2,000 pages altogether, but these were articles that I wrote for American Atheist magazine. And many of them were deconstructing Jesus of Nazareth, the 12 disciples, and various biblical topics. He attacked me, I thought, quite unfairly. He at one point said, well, where does Frank get his evidence for this? He just made it up. Well, I wasn't the only one that he turned his guns on. Many of my good friends were also criticized, and again, I think unfairly. That included our own Richard Carrier, who is here today, Robert Price, Earl Doherty, Renee Song, Dorothy Murdoch, otherwise known as Acharya S., and David Fitzgerald. Well, in the light of that attack, the Empire struck back. and we published this little 600-pager in which all of the aforementioned people contributed varying amounts of material. And it was, I think, a very, very thorough deconstruction and rebuttal to Bart's New York Times bestseller, Did Jesus Exist? Bart's subtitle, which I didn't dwell on when I showed you the copy of the cover of his book, his subtitle was The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Now, this is such a common phrase, such a common title, that nobody except maybe me and my scheming brain had any idea why this might be important. I had been communicating with Bart by email for over 2 years, at least 2.5 years. And I was planting this title in his head all the time. Jesus, not just Jesus of Hoboken or Jesus of someplace, but Jesus of Nazareth. And there was method in my madness, and I was delighted when his book came out, and there was Nazareth in the subtitle. The reason I wanted him to be talking about, or trying to prove the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, is because Jesus of Nazareth is the only Jesus that I can think of that at least potentially could be tested. This morning, Doug told us about the importance of testability in science. And so I have been always, in my biblical studies, I have been applying scientific approaches. I am a scientist by education. And so this testability is important. And so to understand this idea of testability, I need to digress just a little bit to talk about scientifically meaningful statements versus scientifically meaningless statements. Let's consider two silly sentences. Casually, both of these sentences you might say, oh, well, those are both false. Well, I will maintain that no, only one of them is false. Let's look at these. The moon is made of green cheese. The other one, undetectable gremlins inhabit the rings of Saturn. Okay, I think some of you have already cut to the chase there. The moon is made of green cheese is testable. And it was testable, at least in your imagination, long before we sent a man to the moon who reached down and picked up some lunar regolith and saw that it didn't work well on his salad dressing at all. Because you could have imagined, centuries ago, you could have imagined being on the moon without breaking any of the laws, the known laws of physics or any other natural laws. And you could imagine a test that could determine if it were carried out. You could imagine a way that you could test whether the moon is made of green cheese or not. And then, of course, it turned out that it was tested, and actually it was tested long before we got to the moon because we invented spectroscopy and all these things that allowed us to figure out what the moon was made of long before we stepped on the moon. But anyway, so the moon is made of green cheese is a meaningful statement scientifically, and it turns out that it is false. But let's look at the second sentence. Undetectable gremlins inhabit the rings of Saturn. Now, we know that there are lots of, or at least until recently, there were lots of creationists at NASA. Amazingly. I'm not kidding. And we could imagine these wizards sending their most sensitive gremlinometers to Saturn. And by definition, though, no matter how exquisite these instruments might be, they will never be able to detect undetectable gremlins. And so, this sentence, because you cannot even imagine a way to test it, not just that in practice can't test it, but can't even imagine a way that you could test it, is meaningless. It can't even be false. Now, before I go further, I need to make one important thing. When we talk about scientifically meaningful versus meaningless statements, we're talking about veridically meaningful or veridically meaningless. We are ruling out of this discussion ethical statements and aesthetic statements. You can never prove or disprove. You can't imagine a way to test whether a Beethoven sonata is better than one of my polkas. You could take a survey of people and you could say, well, yeah, more people prefer Beethoven than Zindler. But that's not proving the actual claim itself, right? That Beethoven is more beautiful than Zindler. So we are leaving these important things. These can be emotionally extremely meaningful to us as human beings, but they have no veridical meaning. Well, this brings us then to the question of testing Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth versus Jesus of any place at all. With the case of Jesus of Nazareth, we immediately can perceive a parallel between Jesus of Nazareth and the Wizard of Oz, and the land of Oz. So Jesus of Nazareth and the town of Nazareth, and the Wizard of Oz and the land of Oz. Now, we know, of course, that the Wizard of Oz was not real, he was not historical, because our extensive survey of Kansas shows no trace on the Emerald City. And so we were able to do an exhaustive search. All of the satellite photographs, no trace whatsoever from border to border. Well, it so happens that a similar thing could be done for Nazareth, and has been done. In this case, we can prove a negative by exhaustive search. Before I go a little bit further, if you are making a claim, for example, that there is a unicorn in my upstairs clothes closet, all I need to do to disprove that claim, I mean, I can immediately imagine how to test it, right? All I do is go to my clothes closet and look. And the closet is small enough that if there were a unicorn in there, I would be able to see it. Of course, they might say, oh, well, no, I forgot to tell you. That unicorn is microscopic. Well, I didn't see it. But even if that unicorn is microscopic, you could imagine, it wouldn't be practical, but you could imagine how you could go about testing whether there is a microscopic unicorn in my upstairs clothes closet. Okay. Renee Psalm, one of my good friends and one of my authors, in 2008, I published his book, The Myth of Nazareth, and there are copies of that for sale over here at $5. In that, he went through all of the archaeological reports, excavation reports that have ever been done at this town, now called Nazareth, at the locations that are called the venerated sites. These are the sites where the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church assure us Mary had a little, no. Mary was where she lived and where Jesus did his woodworking. But anyway, what Renee's found even shocked me, even though I had done a similar thing 30 years earlier, but I did not do it as thoroughly as he did, and he didn't know about my work at all. So he did this independently, and it was much more methodical. He found that when you sorted all these things out, and he saw that some of the things had been counted twice and dated in 2 different ways and so forth, that even these ancient, these authors, these Roman Catholic authors for the most part, did not even make claims for more than just a couple artifacts, pieces of broken crockery and so on, that they claimed that those dated from the turn of the era when Jesus and the Holy Family should have been living there. So he then rightfully concluded, well, no Nazareth at the turn of the century, turn of the era, and no Jesus of Nazareth at the turn of the era. Now, of course, there's only would be disproving Jesus of Nazareth. You get my point, I hope. That Jesus of someplace else is just, how are we going to test that? And so I'm thinking that the Jesus of any place at all is about in the same category as the undetectable gremlins that allegedly inhabit the rings of Saturn. Now, in the 2008 book, The Myth of Nazareth, Rene, he predicted, very, very accurately predicted, that this would be such a shock to the tourism industry in Israel that the situation would be remedied rather quickly, that artifacts would be turning up to show indeed that Nazareth existed, and my goodness, it took less than a year before they started to come in. And so they now have a house from the time of Jesus, a farm from the time of Jesus, the Nazareth village farm. Coins have cropped up. One of our criticisms was that nobody had ever found a coin dating to the turn of the era or earlier. And so, my goodness, now we are having reports of these coins. And so, Rene immediately started to work, and I was collaborating with him to publish this book, Nazareth Gate. Quack Archaeology, Holy Hoaxes, and the Invented Town of Jesus. We had our own man on the ground in Israel, and he was taking photographs of these excavation sites. And so we could see how, in the case of the house from the time of Jesus, how the excavation changed to make it look more and more like there was a wall there and things like that. And so this book is, I think, really, really important. Now, because the rest of my lecture is going to be presuming that Nazareth did not exist at the turn of the era, and because the proof of that is very, very complex, I have given you all a handout of several pages of arguments and evidences that Nazareth did not exist or was not inhabited at the turn of the era. So that's your homework to study. Now, one of the other things that Bart dwelled upon in his book had to do with the burden of proof. I think he at some point began to get uncomfortable in seeing that he really wasn't able to come up with anything solid for the historicity of even Jesus of any place at all. And so he then began to feel it necessary to rely upon the status quo. And the burden of proof, he said, would be on those of us who deny the historicity of Jesus, and that the people with the affirmative really didn't need to go anything further, do anything further, that everybody's known. But we had a problem, and I come across this problem when I'm debating creationists as well. But religiously thinking types of people, that's a contradiction, that's an oxymoron. But anyway, Bart, although he's an atheist, still has some theistic reflexes, I think. The burden of proof is different in science than it is in American law. This is a really crucial point to always think about. In American law, a person is innocent until proven guilty. And in the American law, the burden of proof is on the negative. That is, if you're saying, no, you are not innocent, that's kind of getting convoluted there, but basically the negative is saying you are not innocent. And in science, it's the opposite way around. Science assumes the negative. And the burden of proof in science is on the affirmative. In science, the affirmative asserts the existence of a thing or a process or a relationship. And if you're saying the continents are moving, you have to come up with the evidence. It's not the immobile Earth people that have to disprove your idea. You have to come up with the evidence that the continents are actually moving. And incidentally, I lived through the tectonic revolution. I was working on my master's degree in geology at the time. that I was taking a course in tectonics, and my professor was not a drifter. He would not allow the continents to move. And that was when the famous article appeared in Science magazine with the magnetic zebra stripes on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. But I'm digressing. Let me get back to this product here. So in science, the burden of proof is on anyone who is claiming the existence of something or some process or some relationship. Bart makes a lot of fallacious arguments, and one of my biggest chapters that I contributed to the Bart book, as I call it, is called Bart Ehrman and the Art of Rhetorical Fallacy. It's a really big chapter. Many of his fallacies are the ordinary things that you all spot immediately. Ad hominems of a mildly abusive species. He kind of ridicules us, although in my case, he as much as called me a forger or a liar by saying that I made up the information. He is very fond of the ad populum fallacy. 3 million Frenchmen can't be wrong, that one. But probably his signature fallacy is the appeal to authority. And here again, I have to digress just a little bit to contrast appeal to authority as a fallacy with citation of authority in science as being an ethical requirement. In the case of appeal to authority, you're saying, well, this is true because somebody really important like Frank Zindler said it's true. But in science, whenever you are using information that you yourself did not discover, then, well, not everything, but basically, when you are citing it, when you are using information in your argument, in your paper, whatever, that is not something that you yourself discovered, but is crucial for your argument, then you must cite that the author, the person who actually found that out first. And that serves two things. One, it serves to give credit where credit is due. I didn't discover this myself. Actually, she did. Okay? She deserves the credit for this if it's true. On the other hand, it gets you off the hook if it turns out to have been an error. Okay? Don't blame me. She did it. So you see this important distinction between science and religion. But there is one type of fallacy, which I call just a book-length fallacy. You won't find anything like this in any textbook logic, at least not called that. But the fallacy itself is one of the very first fallacies you'll find in a textbook of logic. And this is the fallacy called affirming the consequent. I call it a book-length fallacy because you have to read the entire book before the entire fallacy comes together. It takes the whole book to create this one overarching fallacy. Formally, this affirming the consequent goes like this. If P is true, then Q is true. Next step. Q is true. Therefore, P is true. So, to put this, to give a word example, if it's raining, then the streets are not dry. The streets are not dry. Therefore, it's raining. Now, if you think about this more than a few milliseconds, you say, well, you know, maybe it's not raining now. Maybe it was raining an hour ago, but it's not raining now. I mean, the streets would still be wet. Or since you are all Michiganders, or most of you, and you know about Holland, Michigan, tulip time, maybe it's Tulip Festival, and the little Plumpen dancer girls have been out washing the streets with their mops and brooms, and therefore the streets are wet. Or maybe it's downtown Detroit, and the street urchins have broken open a fire hydrant because it's the 4th of July and it's hot as hell, and they're trying to cool off, and so the streets are wet. Well, in Bart Ehrman's book, the overarching fallacy is this. If Jesus existed, the mythicists are wrong. I have proven that the mythicists are wrong, especially Zindler. Therefore, Jesus existed. The thing that is insidious about these types of fallacies is that they are never stated boldly the way I put it here. All of these sentences are inferences from the total structure of the book and the structure of the overall argument. And then a really, really important fallacy, which I have never found in any textbook of logic. This is a fallacy called I call it global because it's over and over again throughout his book, specific examples of it. Ignotum per ignotius. This goes back to the medieval logicians who were still speaking and writing in Latin, and it means trying to explain the unknown in terms of the more unknown. Ignotum is unknown, and ignotius is the comparative degree, the more unknown. To give a good example of how this can be used in religion and why it's not used in science, we can think about the story of Ben Franklin and his quarrel with the clergy on the nature of lightning. Franklin explained the unknown in terms of the knowns, electricity. He had done work with electricity in the laboratory, and he'd also done some parlor tricks, getting ladies' hoop skirts to stand up in parlors when they touched the Leyden jar or whatever. But for preachers, lightning was the wrath of a righteous God, Jehovah. And immediately you see that Jehovah is more unknown than electricity that is crackling off a cat's back. The idea that lightning was the wrath of a jealous God, or a wrathful God, raises so many interesting questions. For example, why is God's wrath so often exerted against trees and steeples? After all, the steeples are on churches that were built to honor Jehovah. Now, why would that make him mad? Burn it down. It raises the question, why is God only angry? Why isn't God so angry on sunny days when the skies are blue? Jehovah's psychology is more unknown than the lightning itself that we're trying to figure out. And again, we get now all the way to the unknowable. Jehovah's mind is not just unknown, it is absolutely unknowable. And why is it unknowable? Because it's untestable. You cannot even imagine a way that you could test something. You can't give Jehovah an IQ test. You can't do anything to figure out his psyche, or even if he has one. One last thing. Bart very nicely summarizes his two most important arguments. And of course, we deal with both of them in our book. But I have planned this lecture only to look at the first of his two things. But this will involve notice, trust me. Bart's first of two key data proving the historicity of Jesus of somewhere or other. By this point, he's already given up trying to make sure it's just Jesus of Nazareth. And he is now desperately trying to have a Jesus of someplace at all. Maybe Book 3. And this is quoting him now. The first point reverts to Paul. But now we look not at what Paul said about Jesus, but at whom Paul knew. Paul was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and Jesus' own brother, James. Well, the existence of Paul is at least as unknown as that of Jesus. In fact, it may be that Paul is more unknown than Jesus for a number of reasons and perplexing problems. We don't know really for sure what, if anything, he wrote. There's great dispute even among Christian scholars as to which of the epistles that have been attributed to Paul actually could have been written by the same person. And then, of course, the next question is, was that person named Paul or Saul or whatever? There are no authentic relics of Paul, even though you can find several of his heads in reliquaries in Europe. There are no contemporary accounts or attributions of Paul, just as the same thing with Jesus. We don't know when he lived or where he lived, as is the case similarly with Jesus. There is no verifiable evidence of where he was born or traveled. One of the early church fathers, by the name of Epiphanius, wrote a treatise called the Panarion, which is sort of the, I guess it means like medicine chest or something like that, or it's a remedy. Says that according to the heretics called the Ebionites, according to one of their books called The Ascents of James, Paul's parents were pagans. He was a proselyte to Judaism. He was circumcised so that he could marry a priest's daughter, but he failed. I'm not quite sure. Oh, I guess this was before Cialis and Viagra. Although he talked about a pain in the side, well, a thorn in the flesh. Well, okay, but now, it doesn't make any difference whether the Ebionites were correct or not, but they are an ancient witness here, that they are relevant to our question. If the Ebionites were correct, then how could we accept the accounts of Paul in the book of Acts, for example? How could we accept his visit to the so-called brother of the Lord as being true? How could we accept the validity of the Pauline epistles? So the more and more data that we get that relate to Paul, especially data from ancient times, these raise more and more questions. And the more questions we have, the more Paul, quote unquote now, becomes more and more unknown. What if the Dutch radical critics, these were, as you see, Dutch scholars, writing at the turn of the 20th century, and I don't know how long but I think they may have gone past World War I, but I don't remember right off the top of my head. But they argued that none of the Pauline epistles were authentic. And some of them argued that the epistles were much later than the traditional dates of like 54 to 58 or 60. But now, even if these Dutch critics were wrong, the data that they do produce in their work show that Ehrman's argument from Paul is employing the ignotum per ignotius fallacy. He's trying to explain Jesus in terms of all of this stuff purportedly relating to Paul, but with even less information. So why should we believe the stories in the so-called authentic Pauline epistles any more than those found in Hebrews? The Hebrews was supposedly written by Paul too, but was figured out a long time ago already, before I was born, as not being authentic. Or James, the so-called brother of Jesus, according to some. But the book of James itself doesn't say, my big brother Jesus. Why believe any of them? This is really interesting. And again, making Paul even more unknown. Epiphanius has a discussion of another heretical group called the Carpocratians. And he says that Carpocrates, now this name is kind of interesting to me. I dissected it as meaning something like fruit rule or fruit power. Richard, are you here? Is Richard here? Yeah, how do you analyze Carpocrates, Richard? Yeah, I think it has something like fruit power or fruit control or rule by the fruits of who knows what. Anyway, rule by the fruits, let's go with that. Anyway, Epiphanius says that Carpocrates worshipped images of Jesus, Paul, Homer, and Pythagoras. Now, I wonder where he got those images, but the point here, though, is if he is worshiping images of Paul, Well, maybe Paul was a god also. Well, can we imagine a way to test that hypothesis? Well, I can't. So, focusing in more and more, where did Ehrman get his so-called evidence? Bart gets his key data about Paul from the 2nd chapter of Galatians. When was Galatians written? By whom was Galatians written? Has it been altered since it was written? Amazingly, Ehrman says yes, it has been altered since it was written. In his very early treatise on the Orthodox corruption of Scripture, a really, really excellent book, he shows that some passages in Galatians have been altered to confute these so-called dosagists, the antichrists of the 1st and 2nd epistle of John. The dosagists said Christ only seemed to have a body until pain. To thwart the docetists, Jesus was given a real body. To thwart the docetists, he was given 2 different births in Matthew and Luke. They don't agree at all. 2 conflicting genealogies, again in Matthew and Luke. He was given a mother, who is not named, as I recall, in Mark. And siblings, a cousin, John the Baptist, and a hometown by the name of Nazareth. Well, assuming that Paul existed, how can we be sure that he was acquainted with, quote, Jesus' closest disciple, Peter? How can Ehrman know for sure that Cephas was, of course, Simon Peter? He refers to Galatians 1:18. Quote, 3 years later, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas. I stayed with him for a fortnight without seeing any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. What I write is plain truth. Before God, I am not lying. Now, I know he's got a used car for sale. So, if Paul was a real person, if Paul wrote Galatians, if Paul wasn't lying, if Paul's memory was accurate, if he spent exactly 14 days in Jerusalem, if Cephas was the same person as Peter, yada, 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 ignotum per ignodius. Was Cephas the rock? By the way, Cephas in Aramaic means rock, and Peter in Greek means rock. It would appear to be a nickname in both languages. Now, ancient texts actually know of at least three different, quote, rockies or rocks. There's Peter, Cephas, and Mithras. Mithras was often referred to as the rock, and there are several different types of origin myths for Mithras, but one of them has him being born of a rock or of a mountain. So we have three of these, and Bart is ignoring Mithras. Not that I'm claiming that it was Mithras, but it is raising another question, making this more unknown. Cephas wasn't just a rock, however. He might also have been a pillar. In Galatians 2:9, we read, "And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace," many scholars say Peter is an interpolation in Galatians. In the oldest manuscripts of Galatians 1:18, we have Cephas, but later manuscripts change it to Peter. And some manuscripts lack the second reference to Peter. Galatians 2, verses 7 to 8, that is one long, run-on, messy sentence, and it is just so messed up grammatically that I can't imagine that anyone could have written anything like that. To start with, I can see how the text could have gotten screwed up and ended up like that, but I can't imagine anybody writing that to start with. This brings us to James, the brother of the Lord. Again, no evidence for him outside the New Testament. Earliest mention in the Gospels is in Mark 6, verse 3. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judah and Simon? Now, interestingly, that verse in Mark 6:3 is copied by Matthew, who copied almost the whole Greek text of Mark. That is copied in Matthew 13, verse 55. Curiously, it is not copied by Luke, who also copied almost the entire Greek text of Mark. Well, why didn't Luke copy Mark 6, verse 3? Well, maybe, I'm not saying I can prove this, but maybe Luke was copying from an early, Docetist, more friendly manuscript of Mark, in which the Holy Family had not yet been invented. We know that the ancient Docetists were reported to prefer Mark to the other of the three canonical Gospels. And maybe the original Mark had none of this anti-Docetist stuff in it. The name of one of the brothers, Joseph, is unstable in manuscripts of Mark 6:3 and Matthew 13:55. So maybe Mark 6:3 was a contrapolation made for theopolitical purposes to thwart the Docetists. More questions? More unknowns. Bart equates these names. Brother of the Lord, he relates to brother of Jesus. Brother of Jesus equals James, the brother of Jesus. Brother of the Lord equals James, the brother of Jesus. Well, Paul, however, also thinks that James was a pillar. Let me give some discussion here on what I think was the brother of the Lord. In the Septuagint, the so-called Book of the 70, hence LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the word Lord, or Kyrios, was always used instead of the divine secret name, Yahweh, or the so-called Tetragrammaton. I didn't have a Paleo-Hebrew font that I put in here, so I just used a very, very modern Hebrew font there with the Tetragrammaton. And we know that there was a death penalty for pronouncing the so-called Shem, this is simply the name, the ineffable secret name of the deity. Leviticus 24:16 in the New English Bible translation, the only really accurate translation I've seen of this, it says, whoever utters the name of the Lord, that's Shem Yahweh, shall be put to death. Most translations, including the King James, say whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord. In this case, it's blasphemy to say Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. Blasphemy. But so, in the Greek Bible, Lord was substituted for Yahweh. So maybe James was actually a brother of Yahweh. Now, not, of course, according to the ectoplasmic flesh, but if James and Jesus, if James and Cephas and John were pillars, maybe there was a brotherhood of Yahweh at Jerusalem, a sacred brotherhood, representing the 12 signs of the zodiac. Might they have been part of an astral cult involved with the solarization of Jewish religion at the turn of the era? We see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, I'm not able to prove this, but these are serious questions that make the whole subject more and more deeply rooted and unknown. The more we know, the more questions. The more the legitimate questions, the more unknown Paul and James, the brother of the Lord, become. Ignored. And finally, I want to talk just a teensy bit about, that was Canadian, I just spoke Canadian, did you hear that? There's no telling what I'll do when I get on stage. Artaxerxes, by the way, that name is pronounced Thrace. It's not Druze, it's not an English name, it's a German name. Artaxerxes, in his book, The Legend of St. Peter, argued that Simon Peter was merely a transformation of Hercules. There was a great Hercules cult at Cyrene in Libya, a city which had a very large Jewish population. And so this makes me wonder, well, okay, Simon of Cyrene, remember, he picks up Jesus' cross. He's sort of enlisted to do this when Jesus is staggering under the weight of the cross. And Simon Peter, maybe there's some equivalence there, but there is this concept of Hercules as crucifer. Hercules as the cross carrier, or the cross bearer, There is an ancient gem. I don't know where it resides now. I got this image from a book published in the 18th century. It's a Roman gem, and it shows Hercules carrying the two pillars. These are the pillars of the sky, and he's on his way to the Straits of Gibraltar, where we to this day have the pillars of Hercules marked on the map anyway. But as you look at that image, that sure looks like a rolling cross, doesn't it? It's the way the pillars are angled. And so, although I have actually advocated some of these crazy ideas that I presented today, it's not at all necessary that they prove to be correct. In fact, none of them have to be correct. The only point that's important is that they are based on some data, some evidence. And so all I've needed to do to show is that there are good reasons to doubt the alleged facts that are used by Ehrman as evidence of an historical Jesus of somewhere or other. And that the whole thing is ignotum perignotius, trying to explain the unknown in terms of the even more unknown. Thank you.